Today, we are analyzing the dramatic culmination of the Bolivarian Revolution, the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in Caracas on January 3rd, 2026. This was during that really sophisticated military and intelligence campaign, Operation Absolute Will. The initial moments of the operation were, almost cinematic. You had the coordinated 2 a.m. blackout that plunged the capital into darkness. Then came the cyber attacks, which, neutralized the Russian-made S-300 missile defenses. And then the deployment of Delta Force from these low-flying stealth helicopters right onto Fortuna, Maduro's main residence. It really signaled an unprecedented end to a regime. So the central question we have to address using the material around this event is this: what was the ultimate cause of this downfall?
Was Maduro's demise fundamentally the result of the Bolivarian Revolution's deep systemic internal failures? The political decay, the economic collapse, or was it primarily driven by the escalating, targeted, and frankly aggressive external pressures from the United States? I'll be arguing that the primacy lies with that internal collapse.
And I'm going to argue for a different conclusion. While that internal rot was certainly present, the evidence shows that the unrelenting external pressure, and I mean specifically the strategic use of crippling sanctions, those unprecedented legal indictments, and then the final explicit covert action, that was the decisive executing factor. That's what made the capture not just possible, but inevitable.
Well, my position that this was an internal failure is, I think, supported by decades of structural decay. Look, Hugo Chavez, for all his charisma, created a deeply precarious single-product economy. The country's dependence on oil rocketed from, 71% in 1998 to an astonishing 98% by 2013. This structure, built entirely on the shaky pillar of perpetually high oil prices, wasn't just poor planning, it was a ticking economic time bomb. The moment global prices dipped, the state had zero resilience. And Maduro, he inherits this structure and just makes it so much worse through gross political incompetence. He didn't have Chavez's unifying power, so he resorted to just printing money indiscriminately to cover these massive fiscal deficits. That choice directly caused the hyperinflation peaking at, 130,060% in 2018. This wasn't just a slow recession, it was a societal self-immolation. Citizens losing an average of 19 kilograms in 2018, 95% of the population in poverty by 2021. This, coupled with the refusal to respect democratic norms like using the Supreme Court to overturn the opposition-led National Assembly in 2015 and rigging the 2024 election, it all proves the fatal disease was entirely internal.
I see why you emphasize that, the internal failure of the petrostate structure. I really do. But I frame the sequence of events differently. Those internal vulnerabilities, as significant as they were, I would argue, meticulously weaponized. They were exploited by a sustained, aggressive U.S. strategy aimed exclusively at collapsing the regime. The crisis, especially that humanitarian dimension you mentioned, was systematically engineered from the outside. Look, these U.S. sanctions were far from just incidental economic nudges. They were explicitly designed to paralyze the economy, not just weaken it. The prohibitions they brought in 2017 and 2019 on accessing U.S. financial markets, and crucially, banning the national oil company PDVSA from trading in U.S. dollars, that effectively crippled the state's main source of revenue. But it went deeper. It triggered this phenomena known as de-risking among global shipping companies and banks. The fear of U.S. secondary sanctions, penalizing anyone who deals with Venezuela, it just scared them away from handling any transactions, even for food and medicine. This action pushed the structural flaws beyond any point of domestic repair. It forced a humanitarian crisis that then served as both leverage and political justification for regime change. And then you have the final confirmation. The ultimate intervention was confirmed by these extraordinary legal and military steps taken in 2025. The U.S. posted a massive $50 million bounty for Maduro's arrest for alleged drug trafficking in August 2025. I mean, that's an unprecedented move targeting a sitting head of state by calling him the leader of a foreign terrorist organization. So Operation Absolute Will wasn't a reaction to a slow collapse. It was the swift, pre-planned execution of an aggressive, resourced military operation. It confirms the U.S. agenda was always external removal. Let's delve a little deeper into the economic causality, because this is where the timeline of external pressure becomes so decisive. I'll concede, Maduro's administration severely mismanaged funds, and PDVSA was, rife with corruption and incompetence. But the economic death blow was delivered from the outside. The scale of the 2017 sanctions, banning the government and PDVSA from accessing U.S. debt and equity markets, made refinancing their colossal national debt impossible. That was a targeted move to force a default. Oil production then collapsed not just because the state managers were poor, but because they literally couldn't get essential technical supplies or pay foreign contractors in hard currency. When the U.S. declares a sovereign country an extraordinary threat to national security, as it did in 2015, it eliminates all capital inflow. It acts as a global financial blockade. So, regardless of how corrupt or inefficient PDVSA was internally, no state can functionally recover under that level of financial siege. The external pressure engineered the impossibility of recovery. It cut the financial lifeline.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame the economic sequence a little differently. I think the internal destruction was mathematically guaranteed and well underway before the harshest 2017 sanctions were even implemented. We have to look at the rate of that self-inflicted damage. Inflation had already hit 274% in 2016, and then it soared to 863% in 2017, and those figures were overwhelmingly driven by the internal policy of just printing unbacked currency. That's pure mismanagement. And also, the institutional failure within PDVSA itself, it has to be fully appreciated. PDVSA wasn't just a national company. It was the core patronage machine of the whole Bolivarian project. It was bled dry by internal corruption and staffed by political loyalists, not, technically competent managers. When oil prices were high, they created these colossal debts and refused to save. So yes, sanctions certainly accelerated the inevitable, but the internal structure, that 98% dependent, the institutional decay, the hyperinflationary policies, it meant the state had already consumed itself. You can't really claim external action caused a house to collapse when its foundation had already been removed by its owners years before. The internal rot left nothing for the sanctions to target that wasn't already decaying.
But the mechanism of collapse matters. It really does. You're sort of equating structural weakness with the execution of total economic warfare. And there's a profound difference between a poorly managed economy slowly sinking and an economy having its ability to import basic goods immediately severed. The velocity of the humanitarian catastrophe, the fact that imports of food and medicine became nearly impossible almost overnight after the 2019 tightening, that was a direct result of that financial de-risking process I mentioned. This goes so far beyond punishing state mismanagement. This is an explicit tactic of economic coercion designed to create widespread social unrest. It weaponizes human suffering for regime change. The sanctions didn't just reduce state revenue, they choked the country's access to the world economy itself.
Okay, but moving to the political dimension, the operation gained its necessary moral and international justification precisely because of Maduro's complete abandonment of democracy. That provided the perfect diplomatic opening. This decay culminated in that transparently fraudulent July 2024 election. I mean, the material notes he claimed a 51% victory despite overwhelming polling that favored the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez. And that was after banning every viable opposition figure, most notably Maria Corina Machado. And this level of political farce, it mattered deeply. The global community rejected the result entirely. So by making himself politically illegitimate on the world stage, he eliminated the diplomatic obstacles that would normally prevent such extreme external measures. Had he kept even a shred of democratic credibility, European allies, Latin American partners, they would have fiercely resisted Operation Absolute Will. The extreme internal repression and the judicial manipulation, it created the political vacuum that invited and legitimized the foreign intervention. The U.S. was merely filling a void that Maduro himself had created.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that
I don't buy that the democratic collapse was the driver of the U.S. decision. I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the U.S. strategy, especially post-2025 under President Trump, was always primarily military and commercially focused. It used that political decay as really just a convenient pretext. The documents clearly indicate that Trump ignored diplomatic offers from Maduro, including access to Venezuelan oil in exchange for lifting sanctions, and instead, he just doubled down on escalating tensions, closing Venezuelan airspace, deploying the USS Gerald Ford carrier strike group to the region. The ultimate stated rationale for the intervention was the declaration of what the material calls the Monroe Doctrine, a blend of Trump's name and the Monroe Doctrine. And this doctrine explicitly used military power for the goal of creating favorable trade conditions and, quote, running Venezuela until a proper transition of power could be assured. I mean, this aggressive, commercially driven doctrine suggests the fraudulent 2024 election was just the most convenient political facade to execute a pre-existing, non-negotiable agenda of removal and economic control. The external ambition dictated the action, not the internal democratic health.
That is precisely my point. An external intervention, particularly one of this scope and visibility, requires not only ambition, but also moral and practical cover to succeed. If the internal security apparatus had been cohesive, or if the political environment hadn't been so utterly devoid of legitimacy, Operation Absolute Will would have been far, far riskier, bordering on impossible. I mean, consider the resources it would take for that kind of deep intelligence operation. The US would only commit that level of resources, something comparable to the Bin Laden raid, if they were absolutely certain the internal regime was already hollowed out and unable to mount any kind of effective defense. The political chaos and the resulting corruption. That's what made the high-level intelligence penetration possible. It confirms the rot started inside the palace walls. The decay facilitated the operation.
And that takes us directly to the sheer operational scope, which to me demonstrates the primacy of external strategy over internal decay. We have to highlight the depth of the U.S. planning here. Operation Absolute Will involved months of high-cost, detailed preparation. The material describes them practicing the breach on a detailed mock-up of Forte Tuna. They had to account for using industrial cutting torches for the heavy steel security room door. I mean, this isn't reacting to incompetence. This is meticulous, calculated military strategy. And what's more, the precision attack required leveraging a high-level government source to provide these intimate, real-time details, Maduro's specific sleeping location, his diet, even where his pets were. This depth of planning and intelligence execution, that's what dictates the outcome.
The operation was successful because the U.S. spent the capital and deployed the strategy to make it successful, regardless of how inefficient the Venezuelan administration was. Weakness doesn't guarantee defeat. Superior aggressive strategy executes it.
That's a compelling argument about the sophistication of the U.S. planning, but I think you're overlooking what made that planning so effective. The U.S. only succeeded because the internal structure was so porous. I mean, why was a high-level source able to provide such damning, intimate details? It's symptomatic of a deeply corrupt and fracturing state, where loyalty had just collapsed, replaced by self-preservation. That high-level intelligence breach is itself evidence of the internal rot. And let's look at the final, almost pathetic moments of the capture. The material notes that when he was surprised at 2:20 a.m., Maduro tried to flee to his secure steel room, but he failed to close the door before the Delta Force operators reached him. This final lack of basic competence, failing to follow fundamental security protocol in the moment of crisis, it's symbolic of the regime's ultimate decay. The structure was weak, the internal security was compromised by corruption, and the leader himself failed the simplest tests of survival. The external force found a door that was left wide open by internal failure.
I'd maintain that the internal rot created the vulnerability, but the external action provided the necessary force and speed. The moment that $50 million bounty was announced, the moment the targeted cyber attack initiated the blackout, that was the commitment of strategic will that crossed the threshold from political decay into physical capture. A regime can rot for decades, sure, but it requires a decisive, aggressive intervention backed by massive resources to achieve this kind of swift decapitation. the U.S. provided the necessary and sufficient conditions for the capture on January 3rd.
I stand by my assessment that the catastrophic internal mismanagement, the legacy of that economic monoculture, and the repressive political choices, they fundamentally doomed Maduro. The state was structurally incapable of withstanding any sustained pressure, having already consumed itself through self-inflicted hyperinflation and poverty. Operation Absolute Will was the final devastating blow, but it was delivered to a political body that had already died internally.
And I come at it from a different way. While the internal flaws were certainly numerous, the unrelenting escalation of U.S. strategy, moving from targeted sanctions to crippling the entire economy, then the unprecedented criminal indictment, the bounty, and the culminating military operation, that was the necessary component for his capture. The public image of Maduro in handcuffs and a blindfold on the USS Iwo Jima, followed by the announcement of the Donroe Doctrine, it just confirms that the external, strategic will was the deciding factor that ultimately brought the presidency down.
So we've explored whether this pivotal moment was a consequence of a structural, self-inflicted collapse or the result of an aggressive, targeted external strategy.
Ultimately, the material shows that the dramatic event in Caracas emerged from the complex interplay between systemic internal weaknesses and persistent, highly aggressive external intervention. And there is clearly much more to explore in how these two powerful, destructive forces converged to change the political landscape in 2026.